It's always a pleasure to follow the Noble Lord Inglewood, even though I can't always follow the thrust of his arguments. But how I wish this deal might have settled things. Even with a heavy dose of compromise, wouldn't it have been nice? But where it should clarify, it confuses. And where it should deliver, it delays. And far from shining an illuminating light upon the subject, it simply lights a bonfire of government's explicit promises made frequently about the role of the ICJ, about leaving the customs union, about treating all of the United Kingdom as one. My Lords, I think historians of the near future will ask why the EU, with all of its genuine ideals, went so badly wrong. And they will identify one cause above all else. That is its driving ideology, the ideology of political union. It isn't an evil ideology, but it is unremitting and inflexible. A system so inflexible that those who threaten that ideology, as we do, are punished. Punished as a deliberate act of policy. Like Greece has been punished. The birthplace of democracy that had the temerity to vote for change and instead has been ruined. And if you think that is rubbish, please go and visit those poor benighted citizens of Greece and see how they are suffering. But why should elections or referendums make any difference to a European Union whose deafness of ear and blindness to opportunity and willful rejection of the demands to fill the democratic deficit has turned it in on itself, and whose response to every question, to every rebuff, is always more of the same. More Europe. An insistence that there is no other way but theirs. Now, the establishment loves this, and of course they do. They love it because this deal changes almost nothing. Elites don't want change, they want protection, they want the status quo. So the CBI, big business, big charities even, those who only think within the big bubble, they applaud. But just imagine, my lords, if Brexit were put on hold, as I think this deal tries to do, or even reversed, as some want. That won't finish the argument. Political union, the fundamental ideology of the EU, that won't change. So the fundamental arguments against it won't change either. The demand for separation from the EU would return with even greater force, and I fear perhaps in sharper, uglier form. A gift for the bigots and the xenophobes who would treat our neighbours in Europe as the enemy, not as our allies and friends as they are. There are those who embrace the EU and all its ideals, many in this House. But sometimes we destroy the things we love the most. And look around Europe and tell me that that isn't happening there. My lords, I want a bigger, more open Britain, which takes the many talents and cultures we have and forges them into an exciting new player on the stage. Not looking back, but looking forward to the challenges and opportunities of a new world that has already left the European Union behind. Not having our cake and eating it, but finding a better future for our children and our grandchildren, a future that they can create for themselves. Today, we are engaged in a great experiment to test the proposition that it is possible, democratically and peacefully, to leave the European Union, to become a sovereign, independent nation once again. Now, if we cannot, if we fail that test, I fear the price that we will be forced to pay, the damage that will be done to our sense of self, to our standing in the world, and perhaps most of all to the respect for our parliamentary institutions, will be beyond measure.
Lords, it is extremely difficult not to sympathise, as the noble Lord Steele said, with the Prime Minister in this incredibly difficult situation, in an incredibly difficult negotiation. She is entitled to a fair hearing, and the deal is entitled to dispassionate consideration. Nonetheless, I think it would be fair to say that the reception that the deal has received has been less than rapturous. Not just criticism from the opposition, but within the Conservative Party, from Leavers on the one hand, Remainers within the Conservative Party, and of course there have been cabinet resignations as well, and some people in the cabinet who are staying there, but it seems obvious themselves are considering their position. It was in 1997 that William Hague campaigned in the election on the slogan, "In Europe, but not run by Europe." Joe Johnson, in his resignation statement, said that we seem to be in the position now where we'll be out of Europe, run by Europe, and as the noble Lord Steele added, at considerable cost as well. Joe Johnson referred to the inability to have free trade agreements, inability to make competitive adjustments through regulation. If Brexit was to be like that, it would indeed be pointless. My Lords, I appreciate that many of the restrictions, the provisions to which people are objecting, like Joe Johnson and his brother, these objections and these provisions are temporary ones. Personally, I would support the deal if it could really be demonstrated that these restrictions were indeed temporary. But it seems to me that there is a danger that we are drifting into a limbo in a never-ending transitional period. And for that reason, I think one of the biggest concerns is the key point, which was mentioned by my noble friend Lord Howard, and also by Lord King, and also by Lord Morrow, which is the exit mechanism from the two backstops. And indeed, the Irish backstop is extremely significant. 68 pages in Annex 5 of different regulations applying in Northern Ireland itself. The government originally asked, but failed to get, the right to leave the backstop after a period of time. Now the documents refer to assurances that it will be temporary. To some people, it seems as though the EU has a veto on when this period will end. If the two sides can't agree that it's no longer necessary to meet the objectives of the protocol, then the arbitration panel comes into place. But in matters of interpretation of EU law, then they have to refer to the European Court of Justice. Martin Howe QC has said that this will mean that the arbitration panel is merely a postbox for the ECJ. Now, I know the Minister will say, well, it doesn't matter, it won't come into effect if the long-term trade agreement is reached before December 2020. But it won't be. It's highly unlikely that it will be, as President Rompuy, the former President of the Council of Ministers, Mr. Rompuy, said on the TA programme just 2 days ago. Does this really matter? Well, I think it matters profoundly. The protocol means that the EU have no incentive to offer a trade agreement that is better than that in the protocol. The protocol is based on the association agreements between the EU and the Ukraine, Georgia and Moldova. But even Moldova has a break clause in its agreement, unlike us. Is this just a matter only of concern to a few swivel-eyed Eurosceptics, or is it a matter of real concern and a real point of debate? Well, this is what Karl Baudenbacher, a very distinguished judge, a judge on the EFTA Court, and for a considerable period of time the president of the EFTA Court, he said, "It is absolutely unbelievable that a country like the UK, which was the first country to accept independent courts, would submit itself to this." My Lords, it seems to me that we need to alter the arbitration procedures for there to be any chance of this deal passing the House of Commons. Great.
My Lords, my voice is not in great shape at the moment, so I'm quite relieved that I only have 4 minutes in which to speak.
Lords, this is a most significant moment for our nation. It is vital that everyone's right to debate and examine the draft deal is respected. My position on the proposed deal and that of my party, the Democratic Unionist Party, is in line with what we have previously said in your Lordship's House, in the other place, and in private conversation with Her Majesty's Government. In its current guise, the text of the draft withdrawal agreement would establish fundamental differences between Northern Ireland and the rest of the United Kingdom. Indeed, as my noble friend Lord Morrow has already pointed out, Annex 5 in particular would mean that Northern Ireland remains in the European Union single market rules for goods, including food standards, while Great Britain is not. In practical terms, this would mean increased checks on food and agricultural products entering Northern Ireland from Great Britain, which creates new barriers for businesses, including supermarkets. In our eyes, such a solution is unthinkable and cannot be described as anything other than a border in the Irish Sea. The deal that has been negotiated by the Prime Minister and the Government is much different to that described in speeches and announcements during the course of the last 2 years. Indeed, if we take Lancaster House as one example, one would have expected that any draft before us would have freed the UK from the customs union, the single market and the diktats of the European Court of Justice. This is not the case, and in our opinion the draft agreement fails to deliver the referendum result across the United Kingdom. It leaves Northern Ireland subject to the rulings of the European Court of Justice. It creates a democratic deficit whereby Northern Ireland would become subservient to EU legislation with zero representation. In real terms, Dublin legislators would have vast influence over swathes of rules governing us, while elected representatives in Belfast or London would have none. This violates the principle of consent. It also extends the role of devolved institutions and grants a joint committee significant input into local affairs. This collectively amounts to a breach of the Belfast Agreement. My Lords, the precise wording of the draft agreement also ensures that Dublin and Brussels hold an active veto on whether the backstop ceases to apply in Northern Ireland in the future. Both options, the review mechanism or the extension to the transition period, fail to allow the United Kingdom to unilaterally move away from these arrangements should it ever wish to do so. This could leave us in a state of permanent limbo and make it difficult to leave the backstop. The ability to supersede the backstop in whole or in part also expresses a danger that Great Britain may be able to leave the backstop, but Northern Ireland has to remain. That is not taking back control. Under the plans before us, Northern Ireland would be locked into an arrangement whereby a substantial number of our laws will be made elsewhere. Regardless of how damaging they are to the economy, we will have no choice as to whether they should be implemented, nor will we be in a position to amend them. The extent of the barriers between Northern Ireland and our main market in Great Britain will be dependent on what the EU deems necessary. My Lords, we are not alone in our resolve to oppose the risks this deal presents to our precious union. Departing Cabinet members hold the view that this agreement presents a real threat to the United Kingdom. The Labour Party front bench has described it as a de facto border in the Irish Sea. My party, the Democratic Unionist Party, will not step back from our commitments to defend the security of the Union and protect the long-term economic interests of Northern Ireland people alongside those in Great Britain. Ultimately, neither of these things can be guaranteed by this withdrawal agreement, and for this reason I cannot support it in its present form.